So this episode we're going to explore some gestural drawing techniques to capture the soul of a drawing and explore some of the key fundamental information that you need to draw the human figure. Stay tuned. Yes mate, thanks for tuning in. I'm Renato, and as always this show is powered by conceptstart.net, a place where you can go for some instant art inspiration. And another episode of the Drawing Fundamentals Crash Course series, and today we're exploring the human figure in all its complications. It's going to take years to master, but there are ways that we can break it down and learn to manage it and draw it easier. Ultimately, we can break figure drawing down into two key areas, and that's the soul, the essence of a drawing, and the character, the emotion. And then there's the technicalities, which is essentially the draftsmanship of what you bring with your skills and abilities, understanding of anatomy, perspective, and so on. So let's begin with the gestural drawing techniques. This part of the video is heavily influenced by the Alex Wu's gesture drawing class at schoolism.com, so that's well worth checking out if you find the techniques in this section useful. So what we're going to explore now is the soul, the essence, and capturing the feeling of a pose or character. We don't want to bog ourselves down right now with the technicalities of drawing so accurately. All we want to do is explore the ideas behind what we're drawing. So let's get straight into it. First in the gestural figure drawing practices is the line of action. This is basically a solid graphical line that runs through a pose to suggest the energy and flow contained within it. It sums up the attitude of the form and captures the essence very quickly. From this line we can begin to build up a figure that is full of energy and movement. The line of action helps us to understand the main idea behind the pose. So to find the line of action in a pose, we must first ask ourselves, what is the main idea we're trying to express? By taking existing images of poses and finding the line of action that runs through them, we can learn to create dynamic lines of action for our own poses. When finding the line of action, stay loose. Can you see how much of a difference the impact the green and the blue lines have compared to the red? The line must be continuous and flow from one point to the next with a fluid motion. The idea here is simplification and flow of energy. To find the line of action is a good indication to place it where the areas of most tension are. So where is the energy flowing? Where is the energy being exerted towards or against? Finding the overall shape of a pose helps us to understand the composition. It works by identifying the main shape that surrounds the pose. Through the simplification process, the idea, mood, or feeling of the pose should be apparent. Shape language is a subject in itself which will feature in the next video, but for now you should notice that the shapes you discover suggest the overall idea of the pose in terms of balance and movement. Is the person resting? Is there a fast movement? Is the pose grounded? Is the pose balanced or unbalanced? To find the shape, don't focus on details. Look to connect the key points around the figure and try to capture it within the fewest lines possible. This is a process of simplification, remember. Obviously a pose needs context, so if we add in a line at the bottom, we can begin to see the idea more clearly. The red arrows help to show us the balance and flow of energy based on the more dominant sides of the shape. So when drawing future poses, consider the base shape of the pose. Does it reflect the overall idea or feeling that you want to convey? A silhouette is the pose outline of a person or thing fully blacked out. When it comes to design, readability and clarity is everything. An image should instantly communicate the idea behind the subject, like these guys. Mickey Mouse, innocent and friendly, conveyed with rounded shapes. Batman, with his strong, stable figure contrasted with some pointy shapes. Spider-Man, with his dynamic, jumping poses unique to him. And the Hulk, who has a unique set of anatomy, instantly recognizable. The silhouette is closely linked to shape language, so you might be able to see why these silhouettes help to fortify their character. Here's some examples. First, we have two ladies sitting having a drink. The main idea for me was the phone and the drinks, so I pushed the silhouettes to make sure that they're easily read. Now let's browse through and see if you can spot the changes I made to help push the main idea in the photo. Silhouette isn't just about portraying characters though, it's about conveying a message clearly. One good way to practice creating strong silhouettes is to take ordinary images and try to make them more readable. Focus on the main idea and create a silhouette that best expresses it. In many cases, a silhouette can't communicate because the main elements are hidden within the silhouette itself, so standalone it can't be read. Ideally, the main idea of a pose should be read through silhouette alone. An engaging image usually has a good sense of depth to it, so basically the appearance of lots of space from the foreground all the way through to the background. Creating figures with a sense of space is one of the ways to achieve this depth. A good way to practice is to take existing photos that appear quite flat or don't have much space in between the limbs and push or pull them forwards or backwards. Understanding perspective is important when it comes to adding space. An object appears largest the closer it is to the foreground, and it gets smaller as it recedes into the background. Adding depth and space to an image will stop it looking flat, and so when we add depth and space to our figures, they become more engaging. It will pull your viewer in. We can put some additional elements into our figure drawings to really push the depth effect. These are some quick examples, but they highlight how you can push and pull the body to create more depth and ultimately more engagement. An exaggerated pose can be highly engaging. It really helps to push forward the main idea you want to communicate. Like an actor in a theatre show, they need to be dramatic. The actions need to be visible to everyone in the audience. They do this by making it obvious what they're feeling, what they're thinking, what they're doing. They act up. Going through some examples now, I've circled the main idea that I want to push and exaggerate. So we need to bring drama to our drawings if we want to engage with the audience. A good way to practice dramatic poses is by taking quite normal images of people and simply exaggerating them. This encourages us to always be aware of how we're posing our characters and be mindful of how much we're communicating the main idea to our audience. This brings us to story, the most important of all the gestural drawing practices, as it pretty much encompasses all of them and more. Ultimately, it's the end result of what you want to communicate and get across to your audience. The story idea should be the driving force of the drawing. We could use a combination of the previous techniques to help us get there. We should always be asking ourselves who, what, where and why. We can practice being creative storytellers by taking existing images or poses and using our imagination, position them outside of their original context to create a new story. So basically that's gestural drawing in a nutshell. Remember, we always need to ask ourselves what we're trying to communicate and what's the best, most effective way to communicate it. There's the line of action, which helps us to understand the flow and motion of a pose or a figure. And we've got the shape, understanding the base frame, composition, how does it help enhance the idea. The silhouette, which helps determine the clarity and the pace at which we communicate the idea, the instant read. We've got the space and depth, how can we bring the user in with the sense of distance within the single frame. And then we've got exaggeration, where we bring in drama and excitement to the drawing. And all of these things help towards paint up a story, which essentially is the context by which we're communicating our idea. When using these methods for your own practice, don't worry about the technicalities and getting the anatomy correctly. Remember, this is all about the soul and feeling. So have fun with this. Right now, we're about to delve into some hard-nosed information on anatomy, but it's going to be useful to understand how to break the figure down, and hopefully it's going to help you to draw the figure better. So here we go. So now let's look at the proportions of anatomy for the ideal male. This male is 8 heads tall and 2 3/4 heads wide. We break it down by dividing the whole body into 8 heads, and then we can understand the relationships between different parts of the body based on ratio. This information will help to ensure the proportions are accurate and well placed when drawing the human figure. You can see on the grid that from the top of the head, we can work our way down and expect certain body parts to always be there. For example, the nipples are 2 heads down from the top of the head. The elbows always start 3 heads down and are usually in line with the navel. The crotch always sits at the center of the figure, and so on. You should pause this frame and study it for future reference. Now before moving on, there are other proportion types we should look at. A more heroic body type would be set at 9 heads. As you can see, this would be a figure of a man that you wouldn't want to cross. He seems very powerful. Now bear in mind the relationships will change slightly, which can be seen on the grid. At 7.5 heads we have the average male. This figure looks very normal and quite lackluster. For art and design we like to glorify the figure more, so 8 heads is ideal because the figure becomes more attractive and more engaging.
Okay.
Also, the body parts appear to be more in sync with the ratio grid, which makes it easier for us to learn. So by learning these relationships, we'll be able to more easily draw the general proportions of the figure. But what about the details and all the bits in between? We need to be aware of the underlying structure, which is comprised of skeleton and muscle mass. The bones and muscles are responsible for the form changes on the surface of the body. As soon as we've learned these, we can begin to draw our landmarks correctly, which basically suggest parts of the anatomy. Here you can see how the black landmark lines are established by knowing where the key muscle groups and bones protrude through the surface of the skin. The more prominent features tend to require marks to be made. Now let's look at the neck area. These lines suggest the hollow and raised areas caused by neck muscles and collarbones. The bones in the rib cage and muscles work together to create this scale effect on the chest, and we can also draw lines near where the arms fold, just underneath the biceps, lines around the triceps, the back muscles, around the hips, the knees, the shin bones, and so on. Females are very similar to males with a few key differences. Their shoulders are more narrow with wider hips, and because they're not so muscular, with less prominent bones, there are generally less landmarks to be drawn. Alright, so another block of information that you probably don't want to learn, but you have to, unfortunately. Here's a little visual analogy of the human figure on a 2D plane. Now, if we can consider how when we fold it in certain parts, we see perspective come into play, and the ratios kind of distort, the lengths of the squares distort based on the viewing angle. And this essentially is how we foreshorten the human figure in 3D. So let's explore this concept in Photoshop. So how can we work with this 8-head grid when it comes to foreshortening? Quite simply, we can distort the shape and skew the body parts. From here, we project lines outward to create a 3D depth that the figure can fit inside of. This is a good way to practice to help start thinking about the figure as a 3-dimensional subject. Project the body parts from the flat 2D panel and try to work out where they would be positioned within the 3D space. It really helps when you consider the center lines to keep you on track. Make sure you always check over to see if there's anything that appears out of place and make corrections where appropriate. Sometimes when we draw a copy, we don't really take note and actually study the figure. One of the best ways I think to improve your understanding of anatomy is to practice a mixture of drawing from imagination and then from reference. You can draw from reference first and then draw the same thing from imagination, or vice versa, and then keep doing this process over and over. When you compare the two, it becomes apparent where your imagination lacks details for the correct anatomy, and then you become aware of it. So hopefully you won't make the same mistake the next time you draw. A wise saying goes,
repetition is the path to mastery.
And it's true. Keep drawing and drawing, but stay conscious. Don't mindlessly draw. Make sure you're always learning from your mistakes. Superhero poses are a great base to study from because they're already drawn with a lot of gestural practices in mind. So it's a good practice to reverse engineer them. The gestural drawing generator prompts a range of tasks. Here I focused on the block shapes task. Comic artists usually draw with stick figures first and then build around them with geometric shapes to get the overall volume. By drawing over the images, we can see the placement of the base structure and begin to build a visual library in our minds. The green lines are essentially the bones, the circles are the joints, and the cylindrical blue shapes suggest the overall volume of the body parts. When conducting this exercise, consider the lengths and lines of the shapes, the distances between them, how they're foreshortened, and so on. Remember to stay conscious when learning, don't mindlessly copy. Another thing to note is balance. A balanced figure always has a centre of mass down the middle of it, like these guys.
Wow.
You can see they're very grounded. If your drawings often look wrong or look like they're floating and you don't know why, could be because the figure isn't balanced properly. There's a figure pose generator that will not only prompt you with a variety of poses to draw from, but it also suggests coordinates and placement of your figure within a 2-point perspective setup. One of the last things to consider when drawing figures, especially realistic ones, is that it should always appear to have some form of perspective and be grounded in 3D space. One approach to help you do this is to start with a basic rectangular shape with 2-point perspective and try to fit the figure within it. We can utilise the ideal 8-head grid, but first we must split each side into 8 sections. We halve each side repeatedly with diagonals and then run a line from the vanishing points through the intersection points, and then we keep repeating this until we've got 8 sections. From here we can understand the 8-figure grid in 3D space. It's really useful for standing poses because we can check if our figure has correct perspective and tweak errors if certain body parts aren't aligned properly by cross-referencing certain points in the 3D grid. The grid becomes less necessary when drawing more complex poses, but it's a great way to start getting you to think of how to draw figures in perspective. You should, however, always continue to think of a base shape in perspective as a general guide. Always draw a red line down the middle point, which can be used as the main compass to keep your figure grounded. Alright, so that's it on this episode of the Drawing Fundamentals crash course for figure and gesture drawing. I hope it's helped and been insightful. So let's just recap. We've got the gestural drawing, which represented by the soul of the drawing. We've got the feeling, the emotion, and then we've got, on the other hand, excusing the pun, the anatomy and the draftsmanship behind the artistry, which in its own right can engage with the audience. But if we want to fire on all cylinders and have maximum impact, then we bring the two together. We need to be proficient in both of these and understand how to engage on an emotive level and also how to carry and lift the emotion through the use of the technical skills and draftsmanship, and then we can pack the punch and yeah, that's the ultimate goal. Until next episode, which is going to be on shape language and silhouette, where we can start to understand who the bad guys are, who the good guys are, why they look that way. And that is all from me, and I will see you later.